Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our guest webinar series. Today, we have with us Elizabeth Collins from BHP. Elizabeth is a specialist geologist based in Houston, Texas, and she will tell us about well failure evaluation with KronosFlow using an example from Orhan Basin, Canada. Elizabeth, if you can move to the next slide.
Okay.
So, of course, I would like to thank Elizabeth for accepting our invitation to speak, but also all of you for being with us today. We hope you will enjoy the presentation. My name is Marika. I work for Beicip-Franlab, and well, of course, your main speaker will be Elizabeth today. Elizabeth joined BHP in 2013 after graduating from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, with a master's degree in geology. She has held various roles in the organization since then, including the Eagle Ford Production Unit, Gulf of Mexico Exploration, both US and Mexico, and she most recently joined the Eastern Canada Exploration Team in mid-2019. Elizabeth's focus for the past 4 years has been on petroleum systems analysis and basin modeling with experience at both the play and prospect scales. So thanks, Elizabeth, again for speaking today. Just before you get started, let me give a few instructions about the meeting. So all attendants are automatically muted, which means that if you have questions, you can use the questions tab that is available at right-hand side. We will have a break for sure at the end, but feel free to ask your questions during the presentation. We can stop and answer part of them if needed. If we can't address all of them live, we will do that afterwards by email. We will also throw some polls throughout the presentation. So this is a second panel available at right-hand side. So please have a look as well. And finally, the full meeting is recorded. So you will find the video shortly in a few days on our YouTube channel. Thank you all and enjoy the presentation. Elizabeth, you can start.
Great, thanks, Marie. Okay, so hi, I'm Elizabeth. Today I'll be sharing one of the examples of how BHP is using KronosFlow and give an example from Orhan Basin, specifically the Marguerite A49 well. So before I get started, quick agenda. So I'll give a brief introduction to who BHP is for those who might not be aware. I'll have a couple slides on the regional context, the basin evolution, the petroleum systems, the plays, etc. We'll have a break for Q&A at that point. We can answer some of the questions on the background before getting into the bulk of the presentation, which will be that KronosFlow model. We'll touch on the well failure analysis for that Marguerite A49. We'll have some brief slides on the structural restoration that our structural geologist Rick Godchak put together, and then finally go into the model with the scenario testing. We'll finish up with some conclusions, and then we'll also have another section for Q&A at that time. Okay, so who is BHP? We're actually a resources company, and we have more than just petroleum. We actually have mining operations. We're mostly located in Australia and the Americas. We have iron ore, coal, petroleum, and copper. Those are kind of our 4 pillars. Where are we globally? So we're pretty much everywhere. For petroleum, we're going to focus on the blue dots. So we have operations and exploration in Australia. We have operations and exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. We have exploration and production in the Caribbean. We also have a joint interest over in Algeria. And then finally, excuse me, as of 2019, we have exploration licenses up in Canada. Okay, so diving right into the regional context. So in January 2019, BHP signed 2 blocks in the Orhan Basin offshore Newfoundland. So we're looking on the base map to the right. We have these 2 blocks that are highlighted in yellow, EL 1157 and EL 1158. Offshore Newfoundland has a long history of oil and gas activity. And I think at this time we have a poll question to try to get everyone included in the presentation. So I'll pause now.
Ask the question, you have a poll to answer. According to you, when did offshore exploration start in the Newfoundland? In the 60s, in the 70s, or in the 80s? So, Elizabeth, it seems that the 60s are winning with 46%. So you see, we also have 27 and 27 for 70s and 80s.
Okay, so I guess I can give the answer now. It was in 1966, the first offshore well was drilled. It's actually off my base map, so apologies for that. It was drilled down to the south on the Grand Banks. So since then, about 160 exploration wells have been drilled offshore Newfoundland and Labrador. And right now I'm zoomed in kind of in the AOI of where BHP has been looking for the past year. So we're looking at Orphan Basin, John Dark Basin, Central Ridge, and Flemish Pass Basin. And so as you can see, a lot of the wells in this area have been drilled in Jeanne d'Arc, Central Ridge, and Flemish Pass. So there are 4 producing fields in the Jeanne d'Arc Basin. There's multiple discoveries in Flemish Pass, including the Beicip complex. And then there's also 11 wells drilled in the Orphan Basin. As you can see in the little inset map, the Orphan Basin is very large. So 11 wells drilled is not very much considering the area. So there's still, you know, a lot of potential up there. No discoveries to date in Orphan Basin, but yeah, we do see some potential up there still. So hopefully I can share some of that with you today. I will point out real quick, the Marguerite A49 well, this well that's highlighted in the orange right here, it does sit within EL 1157, which is why it is a key well for us to understand what happened with that, why it wasn't full of hydrocarbons. So, okay, so we're gonna start with a couple slides on the basin evolution, just to kind of set up the context for these basins and how they formed. These next couple slides come from a Statoil or Equinor paper from 2010. I think they're really nice visualization of how the basin formed. So the Orphan Basin is one of several failed rifts of Jurassic age that formed in the North Atlantic prior to breakup. Early rifting in the region begins in the late Triassic to early Jurassic, and it propagates from south to north. So it's actually going to start down here, and it's going to propagate up to the north. The first phase of rifting, the main orientation was southeast northwest, and it is associated with Africa rifting away from North America. So you'll see that it starts down here in the next slide. So jumping to the next slide, we do see that we started to extend down to the south. Where we're looking, really the Orphan Basin is up in here. Here's the Flemish Cap, and this is going to be Jeanne d'Arc Basin. So the Orphan Basin resulted from the separation of the Flemish Cap microcontinental block from North America. It's believed to start around mid to late Jurassic. So it's a little bit later than potentially the Jeanne d'Arc Basin to the south. If we move forward through time, that we're sometime in the Oxfordian, a second phase of rifting has started to begin. This goes from late Jurassic to early Cretaceous. And now we've evolved from a southeast-northwest orientation to more of an east-west extension. And that's associated with Iberia now rifting away. So you can see on here the EOB, that stands for East Orphan Basin. The Orphan Basin is generally split up into east and west, and that has to do with this rift in this basin evolution. So the East Orphan Basin begins to develop earlier, so it's developing at this time, late Jurassic to early Cretaceous, and it's interpreted as predominantly Jurassic in age. This is where the BHP blocks are located. If we step forward again into the early Cretaceous, now that main locus of extension in the Orphan Basin has shifted to the west, and we're now forming this West Orphan Basin right here. The final phase of rifting that impacts these basins is late Jurassic, and now the extension has shifted again, and it's more northeast southwest. After the Cretaceous, the rifting has ended for these basins, and we have a thick pile of relatively undeformed Cenozoic strata that's deposited for these Mesozoics and rift sections. So to step forward, I'm kind of going into the Orphan Basin now. On the right, I have a geological timescale mostly focused on the BHP lease area, with some of the interpreted depositional environments, some of the regional conformities that we see in the area. The prospective plays, so we do have 2 main rift packages, the Jurassic and Cretaceous. They're overlain by passive margin Cenozoic sediments. The main play in Orphan Basin is the Tithonian. So we have Tithonian synrift clastic sediments. The source rock is believed to be late Jurassic, mostly pinned at the Kimmeridgian, although there is a little bit of uncertainty in that. And that's because the source rock hasn't been penetrated by key Orphan Basin wells within our lease area. You can see here I have this green arrow showing the section penetrated by key Orphan Basin wells. These are the closest wells to our acreage, and these are the ones that are the easiest to tie into our area. I have a little bit more information on the source rock on the next slide. There is also potential for earlier Jurassic and Cretaceous plays. So as mentioned, this section hasn't been penetrated in our lease areas. There's a thick Jurassic section that we see on the seismic. So we see some potential down there. We also see potential for some Cretaceous. There is, in Jeanne d'Arc, several of the fields are producing mainly from Cretaceous intervals, and over in Flemish Pass, there's also Cretaceous sands that are charged. So we still see some potential for that as well. Okay, final slide for this section, the source rock and flue typing. So just a little bit more information on the source rock, because this is seen as one of the main risks in the area. So there are multiple proven penetrations of Cambrian source rock in the Jeanne d'Arc and Flemish Pass basins. So down on the same base map that I had on the first slide, all of the wells that had stars are wells that penetrated this Cambrian interval and that were analyzed for source rock presence. I have the two yellow stars, that's these wells over on the right, the Hibernia K18 from the Jeanne d'Arc Basin and the Lancaster G70 from the Flemish Pass Basin. You can see over on the right of these two log series, we have the TOC and the HI, and the source rock interval is highlighted in gray. So the source rock has been penetrated. It's tied to generally Cambrian to potentially early Tithonian in these basins. It is very difficult to correlate to our basin and particularly to our block area. You have to do quite a bit of jump correlating to get there from the source rock penetrations. So that's why we still consider it to be, we don't know exactly where in the section our source rock might be, but we do predict a similar source rock in the Orhan Basin. Some of the key uncertainties, again, the location of the source rock and that Jurassic stratigraphy, that goes back to the difficulty in correlating. And then the other thing is source rock richness. So these are two pretty nice source rock intervals. Some of the intervals that have been penetrated are not as rich. So one of the questions is what's driving the source rock richness, and what do we, where do we think the source rock is best? So that's one of these two uncertainties you're going to see in the KronosFlow models in the later part of the presentation. So with that, we'll break for a quick Q&A. Marie, I'll let you kind of field those.
Yes, Elizabeth, we have some.
Okay.
So let me
see if I can answer them.
Yeah. So let's start with a question from Afan. What is the success rate in the basin? I don't know if you can answer that question easily.
Oh, this is success rate. Well, in Orhan Basin, none of them have been successful. Once again, there's 11 wells, so there's a lot of acreage. Yeah, and within Orhan Basin, 0, yes.
Okay. Is this basin analogous to African Rift System?
I'm not sure about that. I've never worked that area. That's something that I could check with the team or with people who've worked that area. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure.
That's fine. Another question still from Mr. Afan. How migration is controlled in the basin from what you know, and what areas did you consider mature kitchen areas?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that we wanted to test with KronosFlow, is what are those migration pathways? That's one of the key maybe risks that we see in the area, and you'll see that with the Marguerite KronosFlow model is, what do those migration pathways look like? Some of the areas are pretty faulted. Do the faults play a part in migration? And KronosFlow has the capability to help us test those different scenarios. And then as far as maturity, unfortunately, I can't really share that information. So I'm sorry, I can't share that.
We have another question related to source rock evaluation. Did you use Great Barras Way in the source rock evaluation?
So yeah, great question. So Great Bears Way, I'm not going to show that well. It's located right here. It did penetrate a very thick Jurassic section. There is, depending on which biostratigraphy report you look at, whether it's palynology or forams, some place it in Cambrian, some place it just within Tithonian. There is some source rock that's been penetrated. It's pretty thin. It's not what we consider to be the really nice source rock. It's not like a Hibernia K18 or a Lancaster G70. So our interpretation is that it's not really the source rock we're looking for. We still believe that there's potential for that source rock below Great Barras Way. So it was looked at, and we do have ultimate expellable potential values for that. It has been analyzed, but it's not currently being included within our source rock interpretation for maturity, that kind of stuff at this time.
Is there evidence of multiple source rock proven by wells drilled in the basin?
So I think the short answer is each of these wells have been penetrated. There's really kind of just one interval, but I think there's definitely potential for more source rocks, deeper source rocks that haven't been penetrated. If you look at the biostrat, which of course biostrat changes through times and with different interpretations, but the majority of the source rock penetrations in Jeanne d'Arc and Flemish Pass, they place the source rock within the Kimmeridgian to potentially early Tithonian, suggesting that it is potentially just one source rock, one event that potentially goes through time. However, I think that I wouldn't rule out a deeper source rock. And then also, I know we haven't looked at this as much, but there are some potential for Cretaceous source rocks and for some later source rocks as well. We at BHP haven't looked at that yet. We're still relatively new to the basin, so our focus has really been on this Tithonian play with the Kimmeridgian source rock. But yeah, there's potential for others as well.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Wow, questions keep popping up. Let me try to go through them in order. So it seems that the maturity in Lancaster is much lower than Hibernia well. I don't know if you can comment on that. Yeah.
So all I'll say is that each of these wells, they were assessed for, and the TOCs were rewound if the source rock was mature. So in all of our numbers for UEP and source rock richness measurements, we did rewind the TOC for source rocks that were identified as mature.
Okay. So is the lower richness and lower maturity in the Orhan Basin could be the reason for no discovery so far?
That is certainly one scenario.
Element.
Yes, so we'll get into that. When we get into the next section, I have some comments on the potential failure scenarios, and then we'll see how I use KronosFlow to test that. So, but yes, that does touch on one of them, is the location of the source rock within that Jurassic stratigraphy. Does that have an impact on maturity? And then as well, one of the other uncertainties that I don't have mentioned here is the heat flow. Due to the rift timing, and does that timing just not add up? Is the source rock immature? Is it over mature? So I'll get into a little bit more of that in the next section.
Okay, I'll get just two more questions. What kind of oils are contained in the sediments, light or heavy?
So generally, the oils are pretty light. I think if I'm remembering correctly, like 30 to 35 is generally the average. There are some, like the Mizzen wells are a little bit lower. And there is, I forget, one of the fields down in Jeanne d'Arc also has some biodegraded oil. So it's a little bit heavier as well. But overall, it's pretty light oil, if I'm remembering correctly.
And last question for this break, is there regional seismic? Is there no regional seismic showing potential source rock interval?
Yeah, so that's a question we get all the time. And we do have seismic. We have 3D seismic coverage for it actually extends a little bit north of where this map cuts off. But unfortunately, the QI specialists have looked at this, and we ask them every time we get some new reprocessed seismic back in. Unfortunately, there's not, it's inconclusive. We don't think that we can see the source rock on seismic, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. Well, Elizabeth, just one more that is, I think, relevant for this section, this part of your presentation. Have you seen evidence of salt in your stratigraphic evaluation?
So there, in the Orphan Basin, no. I know that there is salt down in Jeanne d'Arc that's been interpreted, but up in Orphan Basin, our geophysicists and our geologists who are mapping, they don't see evidence for salt. So there's not a lot of like, there's not any diapirs. There's nothing that really stands out as being kind of salt geometries. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll stop for now, so you can keep going. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we'll get into kind of the bulk of the presentation. We'll start off with, as promised, the well failure analysis. So just a little bit more information on Marguerite. So the reservoir was penetrated. They're Tithonian-aged clastic reservoirs down at this depth, as I'm pointing out. So, reservoir is not really a big concern. At Lona and Great Bears Way, there were also some nice sands that were penetrated. So it's a pretty sandy area. So, reservoir isn't a key concern. For trap, mapping on our reprocessed 3D seismic confirms that there is a four-way structure. So we're not too concerned with the trap geometry. Seal. Seal is one of the concerns here. So the interpretations show that there's onlap of the seal intervals at the well location, in addition to an early Cretaceous scour, and I'll show a little bit more on that in the next slide. So seal is one of the areas that is flagged as could potentially be the failure mechanism. Source, as mentioned, the well TDs in the Tithonian, so no source rock was encountered at the Marguerite area. And as mentioned, it's pretty difficult to correlate into this area from some of the known source rock penetrations. So that is still a question. And then charge. So once again, no hydrocarbons encountered. So that's also one of the key concerns that comes out. And I'll flip to the next slide because this goes a little bit more into detail on some of those objects. So detailed mapping of the structure reveals several potential failure mechanisms. And that's why we wanted to bring in KronosFlow to kind of test some of these scenarios. So the first one is the seal. As mentioned, there is a large scour feature that's in the early Cretaceous right over the crest of the structure. So it's being identified by this green right here. It represents, based on the biostrat, about 20 million year hiatus. So, one of the concerns is if you had hydrocarbons in place, and this comes in, have you unroofed your trap and lost your hydrocarbons? Or another potential would be that you were migrating at this time, but you've now taken out your overburden, and for 20 million years, you don't have enough overburden, so you just don't really have a good trap. You don't have a good seal at the time. So that's one of the scenarios that we'll be testing with the KronosFlow model. The second potential failure mechanism is something that came out of the mapping was potential discordance between the interpreted source rock interval and the reservoir interval. And so the key concern here would be defocused migration. So I'll point out on the bottom right, I have some kind of cartoonish spider maps on the reservoir and on our interpreted source rock interval. You can see at the reservoir level, there's a pretty large trap based on the spider map. So you've got a pretty large area, and the Marguerite well is drilled nicely within that structure. If you go down to the interpreted source rock interval, the structure is much smaller, and the Marguerite well was drilled outside of that closure. This isn't necessarily an issue unless you have some sort of permeable layer in between your source rock and your reservoir. So if you have some sort of carrier bed, the concern would be that you would actually spill either up dip down to the south or potentially, anywhere else, but that you wouldn't get that vertical migration from your source rock up to your reservoir, so you wouldn't have any focus migration to the structure. So that's another scenario that we'll be testing. And then 3 is the structural restoration work that Rick Gottschalk did. He identified that there's actually some local erosion of the interpreted source rock interval beneath the Marguerite closure. This is pretty local. I'm going to show a little bit of this on the next slide. But the question is, is there just no source rock locally beneath Marguerite? So, yeah, we'll be testing that. So to get into the structural restoration, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to point out down at the bottom, we have the Cameridian. And this is the interval, this medium blue, where we put the most likely source rock. So the concern is if the source rock is actually at the top of this interval, this whole section has been eroded. So you just wouldn't have source rock locally beneath Marguerite, which the well is, about right here. If we move forward through time, just a couple other things to point out. The structural restoration was used to guide the KronosFlow model, so I think it's still important to show this. And over to the west of Marguerite, we actually have a base Cretaceous unconformity that takes out some of the reservoir interval to the west of Marguerite. So once again, there are several unconformities in this area, and there's quite a bit of erosion in some areas. Once again, so it's something to be mapped in detail. And then finally, when you get down to the present day, as I mentioned, that Cenozoic passive margin, it's relatively undeformed. And then here's the well right here. So what we did for the KronosFlow model is we actually took kind of a smaller area of this section kind of this location, and we made the KronosFlow model. So here it is. Okay, so I'm gonna just kind of go through what the colors are. So at the bottom, the tan is the crust. The green colors are, and to teal colors are different shales, so they have slightly different compaction and perm features. The browns are a silty material, yellow is sands, and then this blue is a limestone that we see at the well. The red lines are faults, and then we have 3 unconformities in this model. The bottom one, the dashed dot white line, is that Jurassic unconformity. So that's the one that takes out the source rock interval. Oh, sorry, real quick, forgot to mention the dark greens. These dark greens, there's 3 of them in the model. Those are the potential source rocks that we'll be testing with the model. And you can see, of course, that this unconformity takes out that very top one. So that'll be one of our scenarios. If we move up in section, we have this white dash line. This is that base Cretaceous unconformity. You can see it takes out some of the reservoir section to the west of Marguerite. And then finally, we have the white dot line. That's that early Cretaceous scour. So that scour is present in all of the models moving forward. And that's to test whether we do have that seal breach, if we just, if that's going to be our main failure. So just to show kind of, this is what the rest of the models are going to look like without the cells. That's just because with the cells on, it's not as pretty. You can't see as much detail, but I just wanted to show kind of the breakout, what the cells look like. And then also that some of these larger intervals are actually broken up into several layers. So that's what the model really looks like with the cells turned on. Okay, so hopefully this movie works. Oh, I don't think it is. Okay, shoot. Back on. Sorry about that. Okay, so so in the model, the same TSC weight percent was used for all of the source rocks tested, except I do have a deleted source rock scenario. So that one's going to be a bit different. I'll get into details on that later. The faults were set as transparent for all scenarios. So KronosFlow does have a lot of different things that you can play with the fault properties, but for these, I just set it as transparent. So just to comment on that. The heat flow that we used in this was extracted from a 3D basin model that we have in the area. So we do have some integration with that. Paleobathymetry was not included in this. I just input the temperature at the temperature through time. And then finally, it is calibrated to the temperature and pressure at that Marguerite A49 well. So quick look back at the model, and now we have what scenarios we're going to test. So we actually have 6 scenarios, so a couple more than what I showed earlier is the failure scenarios. The first one is actually kind of the optimistic case. So the source rock is present. You'll see that once again, we have these 3 source rock intervals. We're going to see each one of those. The majority of the scenarios are going to have the source rock at this mid-level, so it is present. So in the first scenario, we're going to see source rock is present. There's shales in between the source rock and the reservoir, and there's no real seal concerns. In the second scenario, that scour feature over the crest of Marguerite is going to be exaggerated by putting in a sand. So we're kind of going to exaggerate that seal failure. The third one is going to be the lack of focus migration to Marguerite. And in that one, we're going to put in a sand right above the source rock interval. The fourth one is going to be that source rock is eroded locally beneath Marguerite. So now the source rock is going to move up to this top level. Then we're going to test kind of some of the maturity concerns that we had. If we do have this really deep source rock, is that going to cause issues with the model? Is it going to be over mature before our traps are in place? And then finally, we'll move back up to this middle source rock, and we'll check out a scenario where our source rock doesn't have as high of a TOC. So it's more of the diluted scenario. We have a little bit more terrigenous clastic dilution. It's not as rich of a source rock. Okay, so we'll get into the first scenario. So each one of these I'm going to run through is going to look similar. We're going to start with a zoom out with the lithology. Then we're going to go to the hydrocarbon liquid saturation at present day. You can see down at the bottom, the color scale is gray is going to be 0. And then the darker green you get, the more saturation you have. Then we'll zoom in on the Marguerite structure with some comments. And then in a couple of them, I'll have some steps through time. So to go back to the beginning, what I'm calling the optimistic case. So the reason I wanted to test this is, as mentioned, we have quite a few questions on the petroleum systems. So first being, where's the source rock? Second being, some of the implications with the heat flow, which was added to this model. Mainly questions of, is the source rock mature? Is it over mature? So with this scenario, we're just testing, can you get hydrocarbons into the Tithonian reservoirs? So we'll flip to the next one, and then we'll zoom in, and the answer is yes. So our source rock in this scenario is mature. It has expelled, and hydrocarbons have reached the Tithonian sands. In this scenario, you see that there is actually hydrocarbon accumulation at that shallowest reservoir sand. So we know that this probably isn't completely a valid scenario, which to me tells me that there is probably something else going on. So on this one, we are going to look through time. I'm always curious to see how the hydrocarbons are migrating, and that is one of our key questions is, how do these hydrocarbons migrate through time, and what is the timing of it as well? So once again, kind of going to show the lithology, got the source rock identified and the reservoirs, and now we're going to flip to the charge. So in time 1 over on the left, we can see that the source rock, it's light green, it's mature. We've expelled hydrocarbons, and we have vertical migration, which in this viewing you can't really see as well, but if you turn up the green color, if you turn up the color scale, you can see that the charge has actually moved up vertically. We have vertical migration to the deep reservoir, and then we have lateral migration up dip to crestal locations. At time 2, we've filled the deep reservoir traps, and we have eventual leak up to our shallow reservoir, which once again, it hits the shallow reservoir, lateral migration up dip. Finally, at time 3, which is present day in this case, we filled the shallow traps, and we do have eventual leak out of the trap. And once again, the scenario predicts an accumulation in the shallow reservoir intersected by the Marguerite well. Okay, so time 2, or scenario 2, excuse me. This is the breach seal scenario. So you can see in this scenario, I've added in, this is an exaggeration of the breach seal just to see what happens, but I put in a nice sandstone as filling in that scour feature. Source rock is still in the same place, it's that middle source rock, and the reservoirs are also highlighted here. So if we go through to present day, what does that look like for the charge? We'll zoom in. So hydrocarbons have reached our Tithonian sandstones, but at Marguerite, there is no accumulation. So interestingly, there is an accumulation just up dip of the well location. So we'll go through and some time steps on this one as well. So time 1, 2, and 3. So at time 1, expulsion from source rock and vertical migration to the deep reservoir. We have some lateral migration up dip, and we have this nice accumulation right here. At time 3, we have leaked vertically to the shallow reservoir, but that immediately leaks into the overburden. We have lateral migration up dip once again, but there's no charge at the Marguerite well. And if I flip back, that's because the kind of crestal location has changed a little bit. So, in the previous example, you had accumulation right here. But in this example, since you had that sandy overburden, it goes a little bit farther to the west. So just another scenario, but this one is possible because in this one, we don't have an accumulation at Marguerite. We might see a little bit of saturation, so we might expect to see a thermogenic signature. So this one is plausible. So one of the other things that I like to use and look at is the cell history. So in this case, I have the oil saturation through time, and you can see kind of when the charge happened. and that it never quite reached any accumulation at this well. This is the lower reservoir at Marguerite. Okay, so moving on to scenario 3, the defocus migration scenario. So once again, source rock is at this middle level. Now we have a nice sandstone right above the source rock. And the question is, will we, is everything going to go laterally up dip, or do we still potentially get some focus migration to Marguerite? So go straight to it. So hydrocarbons, once again, they've reached our Tithonian sands, but there's no accumulation at Marguerite. You do see in the colors, they're a little bit lighter gray. That means there is a little bit of saturation, but you don't have an accumulation. So once again, we'll do a time step through here with just 2. So at time 1 and time 2. So at time 1, we have expulsion from the source rock into our carrier bed. And because it's highly permeable, we actually have lateral migration up dip to the east and to the west. And then at time 2, we have vertical leak at these crests. So once again, we have that the crest of that sandstone right there. We have migration through our shales to our deep reservoir, lateral migration up dip. We have some accumulations both to the east and west of Marguerite. And we actually, instead of hydrocarbons making it over to Marguerite, we leak up into the shallow reservoir, and we don't have any charge at Marguerite. So I'll flip back to the where you can see the sandstones. So you filled up these structures right here. And so the focus of migration was from here and from here. And yeah, so you just never get anything to Marguerite, any volumes at least. Okay, scenario 4. Source rock eroded locally beneath Marguerite. So now we've moved our source rock up to this top interval. It's not present in very many locations. It's present over here, but it has been eroded right below Marguerite. So as expected, there is no charge to Marguerite. There's no source rock, no charge. Interestingly though, over to the west where we do have the source rock, you do charge your Tithonian sands. Okay, so I'm not gonna belabor that one. Moving on to scenario 5. So this one is kind of testing the question of, if we put our source rock deeper, are we going to have an overmature source rock, and we're going to have charge before we have a trap. So now our source rock is down at this bottom level. We'll zoom in. So actually, I was a little surprised by this one. I was expecting it to be pretty different, but actually this looks very similar to the optimistic case. The filling pattern looks very similar. We do have some downward migration because we do have this, I'll flip back, we have the source rock right on top of this silty interval, so we do have some downward migration, but we also do have migration up, and we reach the Tithonian sandstones. Interestingly, once again, we do have hydrocarbon accumulation at the Marguerite well. And I don't have a time step for that one either. Moving on to scenario 6. So this one is going to be testing the source rock richness. So we've moved back to that middle source rock, so right here. But now instead of having the same TOC as the rest of these scenarios, I've cut the TOC in half. And that's, once again, going back to that uncertainty of source rock richness. Not necessarily saying that we think in this area we don't have rich source rock. I just wanted to see what it would do to our scenario. So we'll flip forward to the charge and zoom in on Marguerite. The hydrocarbons have expelled. They've reached the Tithonian sands, but no accumulation at Marguerite. Once again, the volumes just aren't there to fill these structures. So, source rock is mature. We just don't have the volumes. Okay, so I went through those pretty quickly. I figured there's probably some questions on some of those in particular. I'll just finish up really quickly with the conclusions, and then we can get into the to a second question and answer session. So some of the conclusions. So I feel like this was a pretty successful test of the KronosFlow software to test these well failure scenarios. It confirms that several scenarios are plausible. It's not a smoking gun on any one of these, but it does show kind of what's possible. I think on an optimistic note, the Tithonian sands are charged elsewhere in all the scenarios, despite the failure at Marguerite. So I think this really does show that, even though we have this well failure within the block, it doesn't condemn the play in any way. You can, I think, explain it from a couple different ways and still say that the Tithonian play still has some room for running. So a couple comments, I guess, on my experience with KronosFlow. So we got our first license in December, January time. So we've only had it for about 7 months now. There's a bit of a steep learning curve, but once you kind of get over that, I find it to be pretty quick to build these. It is an iterative process. I think, after doing a couple, you learn some of the tips and the tricks on how to do this and do it more quickly. The first one I built took much longer. I cut the second one I built took half the time, and I'm getting better at it each time, but it is an iterative process. A quick model like this one. So this one, didn't include paleobathymetry. There were some other kind of maybe that were taken. A quick model can be built and calibrated in less than a week. And once the model is built, scenario testing is fast. Most of the models for this scenario, they took less than 5 minutes to run, even a migration scenario. When you start adding in the fault properties, it starts to take a little bit longer, but I think the longest one that I've had took 20 minutes to run a migration with a pretty complicated fault property setup. So a couple other points that aren't on here. So as mentioned, the fault property scenarios weren't tested in this model, but I do think that's one of the things that's pretty cool about KronosFlow, in my opinion. And as mentioned, I have built a couple more of these KronosFlow models over our prospects within our blocks, and have seen some pretty interesting results. And it's really helping us kind of get to some of the risks that we see for our prospects, and especially with the fault properties, because testing migration along faults or using the faults as being seals, like you can really play around with that in KronosFlow. So I think it's been pretty cool to play with that. I think that was it. I just have some acknowledgements and some references. So thank you to all my colleagues at BHP. I've got my team members down here. And I also had some people who worked on this prior to me joining the team, so some of the other petroleum systems folks. Thank you to BHP management for permission to share this. And then also thank you to Marie for inviting me to share today. And I think with that, looks like we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was great. Before we get into the questions, I'd like to come back to the polls because I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh shoot, I did. I blew right past them.
So I asked before Elizabeth got into the scenario testing with Kronos, I asked the question about what was, in your opinion, the main failure mechanism. And I just want to share the results. So
okay.
migration was winning at the time.
Okay.
With 40% of the votes, then a bit of all of the above. Okay. And then came the seal and finally the source rock.
Okay.
And so I just asked the same question, but after the results of the scenario testing by Elizabeth. So I see that some of you are already responding. I will let a couple of more minutes while we start the questions for people to answer, and we'll see if your opinion has changed. Okay. Meanwhile, are you ready for the questions?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start with a question from Philip Ball. So your blocks have a continental transform on the southern side. Are you able to model this in KronosFlow, or how are you able to take care of it?
So yes, that there is, I did not point it out. I think it's too far back to maybe get to a map, but yes, there is a transform down there. The, excuse me, the KronosFlow models that we've built so far are farther north of that transform, so it hasn't been included. I'm not sure if you could include something like that. And my experience, and Marie, maybe you can speak to this more, but you only get one direction of movement in KronosFlow. And this also, I guess, comment on most of the demos I've seen of KronosFlow is in compressional settings, right? But I think this shows that it's also useful in an extensional setting. But I would think that, bringing in a transform that's going in, out of plane, I don't think you'd be able to include that in Kronos. And it's something that we're still discussing internally, how we incorporate that into our models. So yeah, that is there, and that's an interesting component of the area. It's a complex area tectonically. It's a really interesting area.
Right. We'll get into the heat flow modeling a little bit. With the first question from Ainura, what are the hard data used in the heat flow model?
So we have the bottom hole temperature data from 3 wells. So our 3D model covers we have 3D seismic surveys. There's 3 of them that we've licensed in the area, and so our 3D model covers that. It's a pretty large area actually, and it does include Great Bears Way, Lona, and Margaree. We do have bottom hole temperature for those 3 wells, and then there's also some vitrinite data for Great Bears Way. So that's all that we really have, though. So there's a lot of room for interpretation on what's happened in the past with that little bit of data, and that's one of the key questions is when was the peak heat flow? Because that really does have an impact on our source rock maturity. And so really to handle that, in the 3D model, we've just run some different scenarios. We've changed the timing of the rifting. We've changed kind of where the peak heat flow is just by playing around with the rift feature and 3D TEMIS. But that is, once again, that's an unknown. We do have some data, but there's not a lot of hard data in the area, unfortunately.
Okay, that takes me directly to a question from Mark. Hi, Mark. You said that the heat flow was extracted from a 3D basin model. Did that 3D include rifting events, and how significant is the rifting heat flow in the thermal story?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm got to be careful in what I share, I guess. So as mentioned, I did use the rift event feature in TEMIS to model different scenarios. Some of the things that I changed was the duration of the rift. So as shown in kind of the early slides of the basin evolution, this basin started forming sometime mid to late Jurassic. So we've kind of placed it around 200, 190. So that's kind of the onset of rifting. And then the duration can really have a big impact on the heat flow. And so what I've done is, done a short rift. And so that goes to, I think it's maybe the Cambrian. Then I've tested some scenarios where it's a little bit longer going into the early Cretaceous. We do know that in the Orphan Basin, just based on isopachs, that kind of stuff, there is extension still within the Cretaceous in some of these depocenters. So we've tested a couple of those different scenarios. The duration does have an impact because it impacts when your peak heat flow is. And so it changes, of course, but generally that's kind of how we've handled it. Yeah, I don't know if I can say much more on that.
That's fine. Let's change of topic and let's move to the faults. If you remove all faults as conduits, could hydrocarbons still move to reservoirs?
So I think that this shows that. So I mean, I know that there are different ways of seeing migration. At BHP, we adhere to the vertical migration through overburden until you reach a permeable layer, and then you start having lateral migration. I think one of the benefits of KronosFlow is that you can also test the faults as migration. And I think my view is there's a little bit of both. So I do believe, and I think that the TEMIS package shows that migration through shales to a reservoir is a valid migration pathway, and that's shown in all of these models. Not to say that you can't have migration along faults. I think that's also a valid migration pathway, and that's one of the things that we're testing with KronosFlow at some of our prospects.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from David McCollum. Were fluid inclusion analysis at Margaree included in the petroleum system modeling?
So yeah, there is FIS data for Margaree, and it does indicate that there have been some hydrocarbons within the reservoirs at some point. That's all been included in that. And I didn't go into too much detail on the charge interpretation at Margaree. If you look at the mud gas, there's evidence for thermogenic signature. There's also some FIS data as mentioned. That's all been included, yes. And so that's why, some of my favorite scenarios are the ones where you do have some saturation in Margaree, but not an accumulation. I think that's, important information to keep in mind and to include and integrate.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question is from Jonathan Footpage. what advantage of using Kronos instead of a classic regular TEMIS 2D model?
Yes, so I was asked that just the other day. So there is a little bit more time up front, but I actually did build a 2D, a pretty quick, so it was a pretty rough 2D regular TEMIS model over this line. And to me, the KronosFlow is just, it's more correct, I guess. You know, of course, every model is wrong, but the geometries are more geological, I guess. You don't get as weird, you know, in some of the 2D and 3D models, you get some weird geometries that happen through time as you backstrip. And to me, this is just more controlled. It's tied to the structural restoration. So it's more geological through time. Also, in this area, even, you know, once again, like a lot of the demos you see are compressional, which can't really be accounted for with TEMIS 2D. But even in this area with extensional, we have quite a bit of movement on these faults. And so it really captures that movement through time. So to me, it's a little bit of more effort, but the results are, to me, a little bit, they're more geological. So I trust them a little more.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. I think this will maybe make you repeat, but it's kind of the same comment from Johannes von Borg. Could you have obtained these results without a tool that couples structural restoration with basin modeling? Because it looks, especially in that case, that migration was mainly vertical.
Yeah, that's probably fair. You probably could. I didn't really check. I didn't spend a lot of time on my 2D model. I think that the details are a little bit better in the KronosFlow model. But yeah, fair point. Where you don't have faults, in particular, maybe acting as migration pathways, a 2D model might be best. However, we did this model in particular to test the KronosFlow software, before acquiring the license. So I think it was just a good opportunity to use a model that had been built to test these scenarios. The reason what we're really using KronosFlow for, and what I built more models on, is for our prospects where we do have faults and tricky migration pathways. And so I think that's where you really get the value from KronosFlow.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Were there any shows in the mud-log mudgas?
Yeah, so already mentioned that in the mudgas, we do interpret some thermogenic signature. As far as shows, I'd have to go back and look at the specifics of it. I don't recall there being any like booming shows or anything like that, but I'm not sure about that. But the mudgas does show thermogenic signature.
Right. Apart from Mercury, how many wells have you drilled in both of your blocks?
We have not drilled any wells yet, and we did not drill Marguerite. We just got into these blocks last year, and we have on the plan to drill a well in 2022, our first well.
Okay, and I'm not sure you went there yet, but what could be, well, the reason failure of the remaining wells in that basin? But I guess you.
Yeah, so I didn't really cover that. I think overall charge and seal are the two things that are called out the most, and charge in different ways. So at one of the wells, it might be a charge timing issue, meaning expulsion occurred before the traps were in place. At the other well, there's some questions on, once again, migration pathways, defocus migration potentially. And then, of course, everywhere the seal is called into question because there is quite a bit of onlap, there's quite a bit of erosion in some of these areas. But I think, one of the things that I was concerned about was the seal. And it's interesting to me that even with having a pretty decent erosive event in the seal interval in the early Cretaceous, we still could accumulate a column. And that's, the optimistic case showed that even with that seal being compromised, you could still have a column. So yeah, I think that was one of the most interesting things that came out of this modeling for me, is that, it made me rethink the seal as being a main failure mechanism. But yeah.
We have a comment and question. based on all your scenarios, I do believe titanium sands only charged elsewhere. Maybe you can conduct more facies analysis on those lensed sands first. And the question is, can you explain how far the oil usually migrates in the Orhan Basin from a regional perspective?
How far? So I know, I've only been on the team for a year, and I've really been focused on Orhan Basin. But I know that some of the regional interpretations, some of the literature for Jeanne d'Arc, especially, do point to some rather long distance migration from the deeper kitchens. I haven't looked into that as much, so I don't really want to comment on that. But yeah, that's definitely, I know that's been brought up, that it's not just like local beneath these structures, that you could be getting some more long distance. So that's also something that's going to be evaluated with our charge model that we're working on, both with the 3D and then also with these KronosFlow models.
And I guess again the answer is no, but is there any successful well drilled after conductive this work with Kronos?
No. So we still haven't drilled a well yet.
Okay. Any conclusion on the prospectivity of the Orhan Basin to share?
Yeah, so I think we're still optimistic. I think that, this, once again, some of my comments were that, if I go back to the conclusions, that, there's quite a few wells in the area. We think the 3 key wells, which would be Great Bear's Way, Lona, and this well, Marguerite, they all had pretty prospect-specific failures, at least from our interpretation. So it still doesn't condemn the play, even though we have these wells that didn't work. So we're still optimistic about the potential. We still see, there's several large features, there's large structures in the area. We're optimistic about it. And especially with this KronosFlow model, we had failures at Marguerite, but we had charge to the Tithonian sands elsewhere. So that gives me, that keeps me optimistic that this petroleum system can work. It just hasn't, the wells haven't tested it and been successful yet, but there's still some room for that to happen.
All right, let's conclude our presentation with this positive vision of future works. So thanks again, Elizabeth, for setting this up and preparing all of these slides. Thank you for talking today. Thanks to everybody for attending the presentation. We hope you enjoyed it. I will just comment the final poll. Well, migration is still winning, Elizabeth, with still 48% of the votes, and then still all of the above, of course.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, it could be all of the above. That's always an option. So okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, so there are a few questions we could not address directly. We will get back to you in a few days with Elizabeth, just the time for us to review everything and write directly to you. So, thanks again, and we wish you a good day, and we look forward to seeing you soon again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye.